Welcome everyone to the second in our webinar series on fixing child and student privacy laws. I'm Amelia Vance. I am the founder and president of Public Interest Privacy Center, as well as the chief counsel for AASA's Student and Child Privacy Center. Very happy that all of you have joined us today and very excited to discuss this incredibly important issue through the lens of child well-being. So we're going to focus entirely on Q&A and discussion today. Please feel free to put any questions or comments into chat. We may not answer your comments, but we will do our best to answer your questions. With that, I'm going to go ahead and make our panelists introduce themselves. They are phenomenal experts in a variety of areas here, and I am so excited to have this group together. So let's start with Isabelle. Can you introduce yourself, please?
Good afternoon and good morning, depending on where you are. My name is Isabelle Barbour. I'm the director of Truthteller Consulting. I am a public health consultant with over 20 years of experience, much of which has been focused on adolescent health and the intersection between health and learning. So I come to this work having worked with adolescents directly on issues that they care about, and also helping schools and school districts adopt coordinated school health and other school health approaches to support both healthy development and well-being. Thanks.
Thanks, Isabelle. Kelly, do you want to go next?
Hi, everyone. My name is Kelly Vaillancourt. I am the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the National Association of School Psychologists. I've been here for over a decade, which I don't understand how that's possible, but prior to that, for a decade, practiced as a school psychologist at a public school system in Virginia. So I have worked on the ground with K through 12 school, students in schools and systems, and now I'm on the flip side, working to enact policy that protects our kids and our families and the mission of school. So it's great to be with all of you.
Thanks, Kelly. Melissa.
Everyone, my name is Melissa Peterson, and I am the Data Privacy Manager with the Colorado Department of Education. So I started with the department back in 2019. I was hired on as a data privacy trainer, but since then my role has evolved a bit to include basically data sharing agreements, the PII aspects of contracts and like vendor contracts and that kind of thing. And I'm just definitely happy to be here. Thank you.
Thrilled to have you. Nichole.
Hi, everyone. Definitely morning for me. I'm on the West Coast, so good morning. I am Nichole Rocha. I am the head of U.S. Affairs for Five Rights. We're an international NGO dedicated to building the digital world that young people deserve. My background is in legislation. I'm an attorney by trade. I was counsel to the California Senate Judiciary Committee before becoming chief counsel to the Assembly Committee on Privacy and Consumer Protection. So I've been dealing in all things privacy for a very long time, and happy to be with Five Rights now and happy to be talking with all of you this morning.
Well, thank you. And last but certainly not least, Clarence, you want to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hey, everyone. My name is Clarence Okoh. I'm Senior Policy Counsel here at the Center for Law and Social Policy, and I'm also a member of the inaugural cohort of Just Tech Fellows at the Social Science Research Council, where I lead a project looking at the impact of police surveillance technologies in Black and Brown communities, especially those with histories of stolen human rights abuses.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Clarence. All right, well, let's dive in. So legislation has so often focused on children and protecting them from the internet. So I think it's really good when we're talking about child well-being and privacy to talk about why should children be treated differently than adults on the internet? And should children be the only groups with additional protections? So who would like to take that?
So as a psychologist in the group, I think one of the things that we, our work focuses on, on children, but I think one of the reasons that we believe there do need to be some sort of added protections and layers of data privacy when it comes to kids and social media or the internet is one, granted, there's a developmental range, so we can't talk about a 5-year-old in the same way we talk about a 17-year-old, but there is a developmental trajectory in how they develop the ability to self-regulate, how they understand how to use the internet responsibly. But I think what we have really focused in on is when you look at kids, usually starting around like the age of 10, maybe 11 through 16, that is a period of time where there is a tremendous amount of brain development going on, where our brains are just naturally wired to seek out positive affirmation from any source. When I was growing up, we didn't have the internet. You got that in face-to-face interactions. Social media companies, I'm not intentioned or not, are manipulating that part of brain development, and it is they are getting that affirmation from a like, from a retweet, from an algorithm that maybe puts content in front of them that they know is going to give them that positive and affirming validation. That in itself isn't bad. We want kids to seek out those types of communities online, but this is all happening in a way that they are not understanding at all why they feel drawn to go back to YouTube or WhatsApp or whatever, internet, social media platform they're using. They biologically crave attention from others, and they're getting it in harmful ways from technology because they are just not yet aware, as we are as adults, to critically filter the types of content that we see, that we see online. And so I think for us, that does speak to why there do need to be layers of protection for kids, for the sheer fact of we want to make sure we are doing everything they can to promote positive brain development throughout the lifespan. And there's an increasing amount of data that heightened use of the internet and technology and social media is physically changing the structure of young people's brains in a way that is harmful.
Thank you. Anyone else want to add anything there?
So I would just add from a practical perspective, like clearly children need more protections online, but I think a lot of the protections that are going to be meaningful for children are also things that adults want. And we don't have to create two separate internets in order to make this possible. I also think likes feel good, though I can figure out why likes feel good, right? But I think a lot of adults want these protections as well. And so it's not two different internets that need to be created. And as we discuss making policy, we should be thinking about the best interests of our communities and not necessarily, I think a lot of electeds think about the fight, tech wants to maintain the status quo and they say we can't possibly create two separate internets. We don't have to. Like, we already know that this is a simple opt-in instead of opt-out system where we can create a safe internet for all. And so it's not that big of a challenge, and tech will make it seem like it's a big challenge. And as far as, different groups that potentially need protection, we already do this. We see this a lot in like financial privacy and those sorts of laws. Like we protect vulnerable adults all the time from these sorts of abuses. And so we should definitely be extending those protections to our children.
I just wanted to add, to what Nichole was saying, which is how we all deserve protections. And, we see on a routine basis, women on the internet, people of color on the internet, women of color on the internet being harassed horribly. And I think that in the United States, we also have to think about how we think about free speech, and that just because we have a right to free speech doesn't mean that there are not consequences for that speech. And I think that that's an area where we all deserve protections from hate speech, from threats. And we need to get more comfortable with the idea that, yes, you can say things, and yes, there will be consequences for saying those things.
So let's dig into child and student privacy in particular. So we've seen a lot of child and particularly student privacy bills over the past decade, well over 130. And I think we're at 43 states. that have aimed to fill in gaps where the law doesn't or didn't currently provide sufficient protection. What do you see as the areas that aren't adequately addressed in current law on the child or student privacy side? Who'd like to start?
I guess I'll jump in. So I'm coming at this from a more general child protection angle and not necessarily a student protection angle. But one of the things I see, having worked in this space, and I don't often raise that I'm a parent on these conversations, but I do have kids going through school and it's very challenging. So one of the things is that we have all of these different laws in all these different spaces to try and protect kids, and they're all inadequate in some way, and it would be great to have a better, more comprehensive framework. And so things don't fall through the gaps. To use Google Classroom as an example, what I advocate for, like the more general child protection laws, kick in when Google Classroom is not acting under the student privacy laws. And that's where, the age appropriate design code, which we'll talk about later, kicks in. But parents don't know that. Parents don't know when, something is operating under FERPA and when something is operating under other laws or no laws at all. Because Google Classroom is definitely not COMPA compliant, right? It's not directed at children, it's more for a general audience. And so that patchwork of laws, I think, is very, very problematic. And then the final thing I would say about where there needs to be more protection everywhere is very basic concepts, just like data minimization, like only collect the information you need and you only use it for that purpose. And then it needs to be deleted. And I think just that concept alone would go a long way in protecting youth.
Happy to also jump in here and maybe bookend by talking about some of the public sector harms that emerge from the use of various technologies. I think one of the big areas where we do need some additional legislative attention is around harmonizing civil and human rights protections with privacy protections. We know that a lot of the harms that are being driven, especially by law enforcement agencies, by school districts and others, really relates to issues around digital profiling, what some of my colleagues call the cradle to prison algorithm, basically the kind of use of these technologies to exclude young people. And the way that they do that is by kind of pulling in vast amount of data that are available related to young people, whether it's school records for young people who are in school, whether it's young people who have connections with the foster care or child welfare systems, mental and behavioral health records. We're seeing districts increasingly want to turn to those different data sources for a variety of reasons, right? A lot of them are benevolent, or at least benevolent in their approach, right? The idea of we want to be able to attach young people with the resources that they need. If we can identify folks who are maybe at risk of dropping out, we can assign behavioral interventions on the front end and academic interventions to prevent that from happening. But what happens is, as we all know, once you build that machinery, once you build that kind of data infrastructure in place, it takes a great amount of energy to make sure that that data does not end up in the wrong hands. And so a lot of the work that we're seeing is, unfortunately, that data being used by a variety of entities, whether it's law enforcement, whether it's commercial actors, to discriminate, engage in digital profiling, and again, engage in exclusionary discipline behaviors, including school-based arrests, psychiatric detentions, and civil confinement, so on and so forth. So I think figuring out ways of kind of building in and incorporating some of those protections like Title VI and others, Title IV, into this space is going to be really integral.
Such an important
another point to raise to this, because you're right, we are collecting so much data about our children, and I think the vast majority of people do have the right intent. It's because we want to catch things early. We want to engage in that prevention work until, as opposed to catching it on the other end. But you're right, it takes one person who has ill intent or uses that data in a harmful manner. But I think another issue that it's not specifically related to some of the gaps, but it is in some of the more language that I've seen in some of these bills is the concept of harm. what is harmful, what is inappropriate, and who is the arbiter of that decision? You know, I like Nichole, I have 2 young children, one of whom is in kindergarten, who I am fascinated at how quickly he has learned how to navigate the internet and how quickly he can get to things that I don't want to see, not because they're, you know, I just don't want him to learn about some of these things quite yet, but like my perception of, as a parent, of what I consider harmful might be different than my neighbors. And I think about our marginalized kids for whom the internet is where they have found their community. That is where they have connected with people who are like them, especially if they are in a home where maybe they're, you know, I'm thinking about our LGBTQ youth, where it's not, we all want to work to a place where kids and parents can have a healthy relationship and accept each other for who they are. That's not the reality. And so I think as we start to insert these very subjective terms into legal doctrine, who decides that? And are we essentially not creating any clarity, because that definition of harm or inappropriateness going to change depending on whoever is sitting in that seat? And do we want to turn that over to AI, which is not the point of this call, but is a whole other, I think, can of worms. But I think a lot of these bills I see, again, I think they're well intentioned, but they're confusing in terms of some of the definitions they are trying to apply when we don't know what those definitions should be, and we could all have very different descriptions of what we would consider inappropriate content for somebody.
So that's actually a really good lead into a new framework for protecting kids and students, which is the Age Appropriate Design Code. Nichole, do you want to talk a little bit about what that is and how it's shown up in the US?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Age Appropriate Design Code first started in the UK. It's a fascinating little story, so I'll go into it just for fun. So our founder of Five Rights is a former Hollywood film director. And in between directing movies, she would do documentaries. And a little over a decade ago, she decided to follow children, young teens, around right at the time the smartphone entered their lives, and see and see how it impacted them. And she saw the massive impact that constant access had on them, and went on to interview tech designers and businesses and trying to figure out how this whole system works. And what she found was that there are no real meaningful protections for kids online, right? As we all know. COPPA, while it worked in the 90s, maybe when it was enacted, the internet has changed. The data that's collected, how it's used has changed. And so in comes the Age Appropriate Design Code. We're going to talk a lot about the harms of kids today, so I won't go too heavily into stats, but we are seeing addiction, shockingly high rates of teen depression, harassment, child sexual abuse, all of these things. And this is not an accident. The digital world is 100% engineered and largely privately owned. And the system is designed to optimize engagement for profit. I think we can all be just honest about it, right? This is any business, their motivation. It's not just the online platforms. Everyone wants to maximize their profit. But what we're seeing on the internet is that without any meaningful protections, kids are getting harmed. And these companies are allowed to incentivize profit even when they know kids are getting harmed. So the AADC's approach is based on international work that we know produces results and has long been part of our culture, and that is simply product safety, right? So if the risk of harm to children is part of a platform's design, then the solution comes from redesign. Importantly, it requires businesses offering online products to undertake a risk assessment or an audit, and to take a good, honest look at how their product is being used and identify any foreseeable risks of harm to children arising from the data management practices. It's very important, especially in the US. And while this is an international framework in the US, the more we focus on data management, the more we find at Five Rights that we can avoid issues of First Amendment, Section 230, free speech, all of this stuff. We are focusing on data management. And Kelly, I can get in a moment to your question about like who is the arbiter of what is harmful and what is not, and how the AADC looks at that question. But you have to do an impact assessment, and then you have to mitigate any foreseeable risks of harm before the product is offered online or to the public. The bill contains 3 elements that represent a true paradigm shift in how we look at tech. 1, it says that children are under the age of 18. Shocking, I know, right? No one thinks that a 13-year-old has the developmental capacity to make super responsible decisions all the time. It applies to online products that are likely to be accessed by children, rather than those directed at them. So it applies to general audiences. One of the problems with the existing legal system or statutory system is that if you're an audience, or if you're directed to general audiences, the law to protect kids doesn't apply to you. So we know that billions of kids are on YouTube, but YouTube is for general audiences, and that's a problem. So we flip that and we say, if you are likely to be routinely accessed by a significant number of children, then you need to do an impact assessment. And it also requires protections by design and default. And this is what I was saying earlier, that we know one internet can be created for everyone, and it's just an opt-out system, right? So you create a safe internet. And if you're an adult and you don't want the safety, or you want the targeted advertising, you want a more custom experience, you can elect to have that, but the default is something safe from the beginning. We know that this model works. Since the AADC came into force in the UK, we've seen a wave of changes to the design of tech products. They might all seem small on their own, but taken together, we're seeing an internet that is safer and more supportive for kids. So Instagram now prevents adults from messaging children they do not know. It's really sad that a law had to come into place to make that happen. Instagram has also turned off location tracking by default, and it encourages children to take breaks from scrolling. Google has made Safe Search the default browsing mode, and turned off YouTube's autoplay function. TikTok has recently made accounts for those under 16 private by default and stopped sending push notifications to all users after users 16 and younger after 9 p.m. So we're seeing a lot of stuff. Even more recently, TikTok imposed screen time limits for users under 18. So all of these little changes that are making the internet safer. And I will say, going back to the data minimization, that's one of the default settings that's required by the AADC. And so it says, you have to be thoughtful about the data you collect from children. And then you can't sell it, you can't monetize it even after you collect it. And so those are a lot of the built-in protections. And then to get to your question, Kelly, about who is the arbiter of harm and what is harmful. Basically, what the AADC says is nothing about content, because content is a scary word in the United States. You start to get into all sorts of legal problems when you raise the term content. But we do know that using algorithms, where you put in a child's personal data and then you use that to constantly push tens of thousands of pieces of content to them based on what they might like, is damaging, right? It can be emotionally harmful. I can put my kids on YouTube watching a documentary about the largest snakes that have ever existed, and I'll walk back 20 minutes later and they're watching something about firearms, right? Because the algorithm is doing that. And so the AADC says it's not the content that's harmful, but it's the use of personal data, perhaps, to push content that maximizes engagement that is harmful. And you have to take a look at that in your risk assessment.
Thank you, Nichole. Really appreciate it. And I added a couple links in chat about these issues, my favorite of which is the 5 Rights Children's book about what the age-appropriate design code is. Kelly, some education stakeholders I've talked to have expressed concerns about the potential for harmful unintended consequences for schools in some federal and state child privacy proposals. How might child privacy bills negatively impacts schools without sort of thoughtful discussion? And what should policymakers keep in mind as they think about changing child and student privacy laws or regulations?
Man, that's a big question. And I think part of the challenge in answering this in a way that's going to make sense to every place goes back to, I think, Nichole, you mentioned it, is that there is such a patchwork. Like there are states that have taken extra steps to address the gaps that exist between all the different privacy laws, and in other places they don't. And I think, we look to one particular state to kind of get a sense of what some of these intended or unintended consequences of some of these laws that have passed would be. And what we are hearing, and again, in some cases it's new and it's going to take time, I think, to figure out what the real impact is. But from what we have heard from our folks on the ground is that it is significantly impeding their district's ability to engage in early intervention and prevention work, because this goes back to, can we do universal screeners? Because you are collecting data about a student, even though you're not that's not intended to be used by anybody other than a team of people at the school who have, who are working to support your child. It's cut that off. It is resulted in a student not being able to go and see a school counselor or psychologist or social worker without explicit permission from their parents. And I want to be clear to people, especially policymakers that are on the phone, school mental health professionals are never going to engage in a therapeutic relationship with a student without explicit parental consent. But it is because of the way the language has been written, it has resulted in a student who might be having a bad day, or they're having an issue with a peer, anything that can come up during the school day where they need to go and, have a safe conversation, a productive conversation with a grown-up for 10, 15 minutes with the goal of getting them back to the classroom. They can no longer do that. And what they're doing now is they're calling the police, because they have permission to let the police can come in and address that problem, but a school mental health professional cannot. And I think we can all agree that we absolutely do not want law enforcement becoming the de facto mental health providers because of these. I mean, these are extreme situations, but they are real anecdotes that have been relayed to me in places where some of these things are impacted. And I think it's also, it is really, and it's almost, schools are in some ways, we want them to be careful about the types of data that they protect and the way that they use it. But some of the data that is now being thrown out with, we're throwing the baby out with bathwater, and in some respects is data that genuinely, if we don't have it, we cannot support kids until they are in crisis. And by that point, in some cases, it's too late. That's a very watered down version, I think, to say, but we have incredible concerns about, especially in light of the fact that we are in the middle of a youth mental and behavioral health crisis. We can do more to make sure data is not used inappropriately. What we shouldn't be doing is prohibiting the use of it at all, for the intents that for the purposes of which a lot of this data is designed to use, which is to help children and connect them to care.
So, Kelly, I think you brought up a great point around this question of consent, proactive parental consent for day-to-day interactions in schools, for technology use generally. And of course, we're seeing a lot of laws pass, as well as legislation being introduced at the state and federal levels that really deal with this issue of requiring parental consent every time for most activities. And that really tends, other than the age-appropriate design code, that really tends to be the default model. So Isabelle, can you talk a little bit about what we need to consider regarding parental consent?
Sure. I think it's good to start from a place that, it is best if children and their parent or caregiver have caring, supportive relationships and open communication. Like, that is plan A. And so this idea that we don't want parents involved is not true. We absolutely want them involved. But I think if any of us think back to our 15-year-old selves, our 14-year-old selves, our 16-year-old selves, either ourselves or our friends, our peers, we know of someone who did not have that type of relationship with their parent or caregiver. Now imagine something that is psychologically an emergency, physically an emergency, and think about the duress that that friend or yourself was under. Okay. And what we know is that kids will forego getting care that they need if they feel like they can't be safe in that communication with the parent or caregiver, and if that is a requirement for them getting that care. So it's really what Kelly was saying, that you're going to start to have more emergencies show up because the ability to get out in front of things is going to be limited. I think it's also really important to keep in mind that this is not going to affect all kids equally. Okay. So, we've talked about LGBTQ kids, absolutely, for this population. 1 in 3 of those kids feels not supported by their families. This was a survey that was done by the Trevor Project. It's not it's an opportunity survey, but if you get queer kids and you talk to them about what they're going through, you will hear them have a range of experiences. And it's really important that we move forward with the most vulnerable youth in mind. We also have youth that, for whatever reason, their parents are working 2 to 3 jobs. Income inequality in this country is a huge risk factor for youth, and one we need to think about when we talk about their mental health, but also about their access to that parent or caregiver. Sometimes a parent cannot be there to give that consent. Okay. And that's true for kids in unstable housing. We also have parents that are believing that, no care is good care, right? And that getting care for medical or psychological needs is not appropriate. So, there are philosophical issues that parents bring to bear, and those should absolutely be part of a family discussion. But kids at a certain age need to be able to provide their own consent for their own needs. And this is developmentally appropriate with older youth. Youth are renegotiating their relationships with parents and, the individuation that they're going through, and they're seeking kind of these supportive relationships. And we want to have youth have the greatest access to supports. So putting parents in the middle of that is going to make that relationship more strained. I'll stop there.
It's really helpful. I want to dive maybe a little further. Sorry, go ahead.
I just wanted to add, 100% agree with everything Isabelle said, but I think even further, when we put parental consent into the middle of it, we're addressing a symptom, not the actual problem. One of my real beefs with parental consent is that all of these different online platforms get to continue operating exactly the same way they always have. They get to continue having all of these harmful practices. You just have a parent who has consented to it. So they're further insulating themselves from liability because you have an adult that consented to it. And I understand the states that are doing this. Tech is complex. No one understands what goes on behind the face of a website. But neither do parents. And so asking them to consent to this, it honestly just feels like we're putting the onus on the wrong actor. One of the things, the founder of Five Rights often says is, even the best parents have moments of weakness. Not all kids have great parents, and lots of kids don't have parents at all, which is, basically what Isabelle is saying. Putting the onus on parents is entirely inappropriate when there is an actor who has every ability to make the platform safe. Sorry, my 2 cents.
That's a perfect lead in, because Clarence, you started talking a little bit about this, but to dig in some more, part of your work at CLASP is supporting communities victimized by technology-enabled rights abuses, which is a sentence, by the way, that I really enjoy in your bio. What are we talking about when we're talking about technology-enabled rights abuses, and then maybe talking a little bit about this question of consent and how it feeds into that.
Yeah, so I'll try and be brief. Folks may be familiar with the work of Ruth Benjamin. She coined the term the new Jim Code, and it's basically a way of describing the ways in which kind of emerging technologies, everything from the data-driven decision-making technologies we're talking about today to artificial intelligence, machine learning, how they kind of work collectively to reimagine and reaffirm systems of racial inequality and subordination. And so part of what the work that we're doing at CLASP is to examine how that new Jim Code is playing out, particularly in Black and Brown communities, especially those that have these histories of systemic rights abuses. It can be a little bit wonky or difficult for people to wrap their heads around, like, okay, racism is a big thing, and we got these technology actors, and that's a big thing. How do these two kind of come together? So I'll give a really quick example of the work that we're doing in Pasco County to support some folks down there. Folks may be familiar with this story. About 2 years ago, the Tampa Bay Times had put out a series of investigative reports that indicated that the Pasco County Sheriff's Office was collaborating with the Pasco County School District to essentially provide access to kids' confidential student records, everything from grades, attendance history, so on and so forth. They would gather those data sources, combine them with their own in-house data, as well as data that they obtained through the Department of Child Welfare Services, and they would feed them into this kind of algorithmic decision-making system that would assign a risk score to all the kids in Pasco County. Kids that had higher scores were then selected to be placed onto this at-risk youth list. And those young people were subjected to a range of enhanced law enforcement activities, everything from having them come and do knocks and searches at your home at all times of the day and night, having involuntary psychiatric detentions under this law called the Baker Act that allows for them to detain kids for 72 hours without parental notification or consent. And then I could go on and on and on, the traditional kind of exclusionary disciplinary things that we're seeing around school suspensions, expulsions, school-based arrests, that we fear that there's a strong connection and correlation between those young people on the list and young people who are being impacted by these more enhanced enforcement techniques and strategies. That's a really good example, and I'll kind of break it down to a couple of elements around kind of where the technology and rights abuses kind of come together. So the first thing I always mention to folks is that Pasco County has an ongoing desegregation order from the 1970s. So folks who aren't familiar, the famous Brown versus the Board of Education, we thought that segregation was over in schools in 1954. There's still hundreds of jurisdictions that have not actually been able to satisfactorily meet their obligations under Brown to actually come up out of court monitorship. So Pasco County is one of those communities. The Department of Education data related to their exclusionary discipline statistics show that Pasco County has pronounced racial disparities when it comes to school-based arrests, expulsions, and suspensions. This is true both for Black and Brown students, but also for students with disabilities. So we're already seeing a couple of things in place. We see the segregation piece that's still ongoing. We see exclusionary discipline, which fits within that broader conversation around the school to prison pipeline. But then there's this other piece that I think is so important to not lose sight of, which is this kind of mass surveillance of vulnerable communities. What we began to find as we were reviewing some of the open records that we were able to obtain from the Sheriff's Office is that they were essentially using their SROs are school-based police officers. They were essentially leveraging them to be intelligence gathering sources for their families and other people within the community. So what would happen is it would be like a burglary, at 1212 Main Street. They would realize that there was a kid there who was a part of that family or maybe a part of the family of the person who they suspected. And so the SROs were being instructed to go and talk to these kids, gather that information, kind of compile that information, calling it intelligence, feeding it back into the Sheriff's Office, and then using that information to essentially attach that kid to that story. And now we have this kind of building out of this long record that this young person has, bringing them closer into contact with the criminal legal system that can set them on all types of harmful trajectories, right? So we can see again in that story a whole bunch of different harms that are playing out. There are civil rights protections that should stand in the way of these types of practices from happening. Title VI, as I mentioned before, the 1964 Civil Rights Act prevents any recipient of federal funding from using those dollars to support a program or practice that discriminates on the basis of race or nationality. We also have the IDEA. We also have, and I can go down the list, Title IX, and so on and so forth. But unfortunately, because this kind of conversation between technology and discrimination and civil rights is so novel, when you even broach the conversation with policymakers or with systems leaders and administrators, they're like, wait, what are you talking about, Title VI? We're talking about data privacy. It's like, no, these conversations are one and the same, because when you're taking those data to violate young people's rights, to subject them to discriminatory law enforcement, to subject them to exclusionary discipline from the classroom, those are the core concerns that are at the heart of so many of these protections. And so that's really what we're thinking about. But it's not just there. We also see this in a number of other contexts, whether it comes to course selection and enrollment. There's a huge story in the markup, I think it was last week before last, talking about the dues system that was being used in Wisconsin to basically, it's an early warning prevention system that I was mentioning before that we've been talking about, and the way that it uses race as an explicit criteria to determine the level of risk that a young person has of dropping out, right? Like, these are things that in any other context would have a lawsuit, within a day and be shut down. But unfortunately, we haven't quite developed the muscle, and definitely haven't developed the legislative and policy protections to ensure that jurisdictions aren't engaging in these practices. So that's just as quick as I could do it, kind of overview of what I'm talking about when I say that. This is an issue that's happening everywhere. There was a CDT report from, I think, last year before last, that shows 70+% of schools are using some type of monitoring technologies or devices. And that a majority of those school districts are kind of taking that data and sharing it with law enforcement, other entities. So just because we haven't seen enough stories doesn't mean that it's not happening. It just means that we haven't done enough digging to really uncover the full extent and scope of those harms.
Such an important perspective, Clarence. Thank you so much. So you had talked about, where this data does need to be used and where there are things where we want to better support or measure the internet's effect on children and teens' mental health, civil rights, and well-being, including we've seen some requirements to maybe monitor and better control children's online activities as part of mitigating some of those technology abuses. Maybe starting at a high level, Kelly or Melissa, what are some of the concerns from schools, districts about how students are doing right now, how they're being impacted by technology, or how your schools, your members are looking at leveraging technology, either cutting it off or providing access to support student mental health and well-being? Very easy question.
I'll start. It's clear, we hear from our members every day. There are significant concerns about student mental health, mental health and overall well-being. That we have been sounding this alarm along with a lot of other groups for a long time. And I think it's just important to note that social media is just one piece of why we are experiencing this crisis. And it's been mentioned before, but I think it's worth saying again, for some of our kids, that's the buffer. The access to that technology is what is keeping them from going down the path that we don't want our kids to go down, because that's where they're leveraging the support. And I think, during COVID, we saw this proliferation of apps where because you couldn't physically go and talk to a psychologist or a counselor. Again, this is not a call on the value of that or the effectiveness of it, but it was another way, excuse me, for people to connect. And so I think what we are hearing, like our association, we're deciding kind of what our position is going to be. I think that there's a general consensus that we have to do something. I think what you've heard today, this is not an easy fix. This is a complicated, needs to be done strategically and nuanced, and in a way that we are making sure we are protecting kids' well-being. That needs to be at the center of this conversation. But there are folks that have shared that they, when they are working with some challenging students, they see more progress and more, towards their goals when they connect with them in an online platform versus in an in-person platform. And so I think they're not really answering your question. I think this is a very hard and fine line to walk. And as a parent, this is a very fine and hard line to walk. But I think what we are most concerned about is that we don't throw the baby out with bathwater. We don't get rid of all of the good for the sake of addressing the bad, which we need to do. But part of what's been left from the conversation, which I think is important, is there's the one piece on what can we do to make sure the internet itself is safe, to use Nichole's term, we can create a safe internet. But also there's some emerging data that shows if we actually give kids education, like as someone mentioned earlier, we know why a like feels good. We know what the algorithms are. We know why when we open up Instagram, we're getting my feed's full of Taylor Swift videos right now. I think we can all figure out why that is. But when you tell kids how, you give them a peek behind the curtain and give them that information, that also acts as a buffer against the harm. So I think in addition to thinking about what's the responsibility of the company, what do we want to make sure we hold them responsible for? What is also the responsibility for school systems? Not every place has good, high quality digital citizenship. We aren't teaching kids. My son has an iPad. He's 5. He got 0, instruction. It was all like, parents, make sure you're monitoring your kids. Thankfully, I know what to do, but that doesn't mean all the kids in his class do. So I think there has to be an education component to it as well, that we can't expect that even if we do everything Nichole had outlined, which I think is a fabulous idea, if we can get it to happen in the United States, there still is going to be an element of education that is necessary, especially for those kids that are going to very quickly learn how to toggle the button to switch all the privacy protections off. We need to be making sure that we're providing, we're empowering people with knowledge, regardless of what we do.
Melissa, what do you have to add? And also just bringing in, I know Colorado's been really nuanced in how it's thought about balancing these different rights. And so would love to hear you also maybe talk about a little bit of Colorado's approach and what has made it effective in the student privacy context.
Yes, absolutely. So although, Colorado absolutely is trying to, or has an interest in determining, the contributors to our youth mental health crisis in Colorado. So, that's absolutely an interest that we have. Senator Michael Bennet definitely praised the passage of the Children in Media Research Advancement, so CAMERA. So, we have that interest in really determining what is contributing to the crisis in Colorado. Colorado has really started focusing on legislation that really is around the screening, and then making resources available to those students that maybe the screening determines that there is a need for those resources. So there is different legislation that's being passed in Colorado to start there. So to have the annual screenings and in grades 6 through 12, and being able to do those types of assessments. So, and an interesting thing to kind of build up on what was said before around parental consent. So parents can opt out of these types of assessments for those under the age of 12, but 12 years and older, if they want to participate in the assessments, they can without parental consent or knowledge. So, if they're feeling like, they want that assessment, maybe they're not feeling right and they want to be involved in that. And then, if they feel the need for resources, they can go through the assessment and then be matched with resources. Like one of the I guess, big or important resources that Colorado has put into place is iMatter, and that gives free resources to students in that realm. And And then additionally, so, we have the legislation that's being passed. It's really focusing on doing those assessments and providing those resources, whether it's iMatter or something else. And then additionally, there are lots of grants that CDE or the Colorado Department of Education has received that is really focused on putting more mental health professionals within the schools. So there's two that we are currently working on right now to go ahead and to put those in the schools. So we do have, an interest in, the contributors to the mental health crisis, but also we're really trying to take a much, just an active role in, addressing those mental health concerns.
That's great. And I know that so often there's this sort of focus on detecting and finding people and not necessarily the follow-up of, and now what are we going to do with it? What are the supports we can add in? So really, really great to hear on that. Isabelle, in your time working at a state, does this sort of resonate with you? How does this align with what you saw?
Yeah, I mean, I think really being thoughtful about minor rights and consent for health services is hugely important and protective for young people. There are all sorts of sensitive services, whether it's youth sexual health, mental health, substance use, all of these pieces where, having kids be able to consent at, I heard Melissa say 12, or, I think in Oregon it's 15. It's important because you're allowing kids, you're creating an access model for youth to get services. And there are a lot of reasons why youth this age would not want to share this information with other people. This is not unlike how adults are, honestly, around these types of services. It's not really so different. So, when we can empower young people to access services, I think it keeps them more healthy and safer.
Yeah. So remarkably, we only have 6 minutes left. This conversation is really fantastic, and I wish we had more, but let's maybe go ahead and jump to what is the top takeaway from today's discussion, or an essential takeaway we haven't discussed yet, that each of you want policymakers to consider as they craft and improve child and student privacy laws and regulations. And maybe, Nichole, starting with you.
We've kind of touched on it a little bit today, but oh, sorry, dogs. But I think, really highlighting what we call 5 rights tech neutrality, like how this needs to, any regulations need to cross platforms, right? All the different platforms are sharing information with each other. Clarence talked about some of the really devastating impacts of data sharing, but this all has to be looked at as an entire ecosystem of data. A lot of the privacy laws I see allow local ordinances to completely overwrite the entire law, which is where you see the harms that Clarence is talking about, like really coming into play, right? We could have the greatest privacy law in the world, and if you allow law enforcement to just grab any information without even a warrant, we're really running into problems. Additionally, social media has incredibly wonderful benefits, like Kelly highlighted on, to a lot of youth, a lot of adults. Actually, we all felt isolated during the pandemic and needed to be able to connect with people. And so we don't want to focus just on the bad, but we need to, enhance the good. Also, there, like I said, this entire ecosystem, it's not just it's not just social media, and it's not just the student information that's being collected. You know, folks are getting all the real-time geolocation information about these kids from e-commerce sites, right? It's an entire system. And I think that's really challenging for policymakers to wrap their head around, both as the problem and as we're thinking about the solution. But those things are really, really important. It's important that we get whatever protections, right, and then don't allow for carve outs. And I'm thinking specifically at the local level that allow these harms to happen while still maintaining the flexibility for school districts and locals to be able to do what they need to provide kids with services. It's not an easy thing, but it's an entire system, and we can't just look at one platform type or product or anything and expect there to be real and meaningful results.
Great, thank you. Melissa, let's go to you next.
Based upon kind of my frame of reference, which is basically education records and data privacy laws as it relates to students and those education records. But, you know, I would just say that one of the big takeaways, and just, you know, from my frame of reference and, you know, the conversations that have occurred today and the information imparted, I would just say that, you know, I guess a big takeaway that I see is just the need for transparency, just ensuring that, you know, that everybody is able to know what information is being shared with who for what purposes. I think that's incredibly important. And it's the basis really for the Colorado State Student Data Privacy Law is that transparency. It's even in the name, the Student Data Transparency and Security Act. It's just so important to have that be available so that, you know, anybody in the community can reach out and see what's being shared with what vendors for what reasons, and then they can go ahead and implore, ask questions around that. But just, you know, having that transparency so everyone can really see what is happening and then further explore from there. But I would say that transparency is a big takeaway with this. And, you know, we have to know what is going on to then, you know, see how that's affecting well-being.
Thank you. Isabelle.
You know, youth bring so much, so many assets, and we often focus on how they're not doing well, but they are well positioned to consider their options and not be taken advantage of. They're at a point of life where that comes very naturally. And I think when we think about the full power of the federal government or of Congress, you know, we should be aiming at those with the greatest amount of power, and not at parental consent and not at youth behavior, but, you know, to Nichole's point of, you know, a safer internet and really centering the assets of young people to navigate a context, but working to make a safer internet for all.
Great. Clarence.
Yeah, so 2 quick points. I think building off of Isabel's, it's so important to place marginalized youth at the center of policy design in the student data privacy space. We've seen some of that in other arenas, but I feel like this is an area where we can still develop. There's a lot of room to grow. I'll say it like that. Young people, to Isabel's point, let's bring an asset-based framework. They understand these technologies oftentimes better than we do because they are in fact true digital natives and understand how these platforms operate. And so rather than just seeing them as folks who we're serving, how can we co-create policy solutions with them? Because I think the better tailored they are to their lived experience, the better outcomes they're going to see downstream. And then the second point I would lift up is we have to make sure that we're supplementing the conversation around private sector accountability when it comes to data practices with public sector accountability. Because I will stand on this soapbox all day. The public sector is driving the harms, right? Whether it's through the grant making, whether it's through all the different ways in which money is being funneled into private actors, but also being funneled into other public entities. But whether it's looking at issues I described with predictive policing in schools, we're also seeing facial recognition technologies. We're seeing emotional and affect recognition, automated license plate read. I mean, if you name it, it's there. And so we really need to make sure that we're not losing sight of the role of public sector actors, things that they can do on their own, because oftentimes state legislatures and Congress are not in position to reach bipartisan consensus, at least in a way that produces meaningful policy outcomes. So how can we make sure that we leverage all the tools in the tool belt, including agency guidance, including rulemaking, including notice and public comment, to ensure that we have we have exhausted every single policy remedy available to us to hold those public sector entities accountable for the harms that they're producing as well.
Great. And Kelly, you have the last word.
I should not. I will just echo everything that has been said here. And I think what I'm walking away from this, and I will probably be reaching out to those of you on this panel to ask more questions, but it is so short-sighted that I think policymakers who are focused on this, let's ban access, clearly that is not going to be the solution. One, I keep pointing back, I'll probably use this and I'll credit you, Nichole, that we can create one safe internet for everyone. But I think, something again to put the psychologist hat back on is, if you've ever worked with a teenager, the second you tell them they cannot have something, it becomes the most desirable thing ever. And are we going to be intentionally, not all kids, but I think more about our marginalized populations, push them into the dark web or push them into platforms where there is no structure for safety and monitoring right now? And so while it sounds good, it's a great soundbite to say, yeah, we're gonna prohibit kids under the age of 13 from accessing any type of technology or social media. That is not going to solve the problem, because again, they're going to turn 14, and are they going to have any experience with how to use it responsibly? That the shift really should be, what do we do to make sure that every single technology platform that everyone, not just kids, is interacting with is safe, then has robust data protections, as Clarence mentioned, so that we are making sure that there are strong guardrails, that if we're collecting data, everybody knows how it's being used, for what purpose it's for, and there are clear processes that have to be followed if somebody needs to access that data. That is a hard problem to solve, but I think, we need to move in the direction that banning and getting rid of this is not, it's too late for that. We have moved past that as a society. We need to make sure that every platform is safe.
Well, definitely, as policymakers consider all of this, having folks like you in the room is obviously so important. And I am so honored and thrilled that all of you were able to join the webinar today. So we will be sending out the recording as well as some resources. Please feel free to email if you have additional questions that come up. But for now, thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you to all of our expert panelists for sharing their knowledge and expertise. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their day. Thanks so much.